All right, so we're going to turn our attention to Module 42. That will be the last one of this series when we're talking about personality. And there are three different areas that we want to pay attention to, which are quite important, actually, when we're talking about personality. One is the trait theories themselves. And there are a variety of these. As a matter of fact, probably a lot of the way you think about personality is in terms of traits. There is the social cognitive theories, which will connect up with our next chapter when we talk about social psychology. But social cognitive, you can get some clue about what direction these will go when we're talking about personality being influenced and situationally determined by the environment in which the person is actually learning. And then finally we have the self. So one of the things that I like to do when we begin to tackle a subject is to be very clear first about what our actual terms are. And one of the key terms to understanding trait theories is actually defining what a trait actually is. And trait theorists typically attempt to describe personality in terms of stable and enduring behavior patterns. Or the other possibility is they might also add dispositions that people have relative to feeling and acting, disposition to feel or act. And each of those fall into that category. Now, the opposite, if you want to understand a trait a little further, is the idea of a state. If someone were to say, what state is your heart in, you might say that I feel kind of sad today. Well, that's a state. It's not something that necessarily will be enduring or stable. So this is seen as a temporary condition, the state of a person. So to contrast trait, we would look at someone's state, and we actually do that when we talk about anxiety, is that somebody might have a state anxiety. It's connected to the situation that they're in, or they might have a trait of anxiety, so they tend to be more of an anxious kind of person. So trait and state are key characteristics. The way that we measure traits oftentimes is with a statistical procedure called factor analysis. And one way that I tend to describe factor analysis is a little bit like if you were to go out to a gravel yard and they have ways of sifting. If a front end loader takes this huge bucket full of rock and they drop it into a container that oftentimes has a series of screens in it. And one screen has really big slats in it, and it captures the largest boulders on top, but all the smaller ones fall to a smaller one that is even more fine and captures smaller gravel and so forth, all the way down to things that are very, very fine, and they fall to the bottom, and so they're left with the finest portions. Well, essentially, the big boulders, if you will, that are caught in this grid up here are the things that we refer to as traits in personality. When they do a factor analysis, they sift through all of these data, and the biggest chunks that all seem to bond together are what we refer to as traits. And so two researchers in particular that did this was the ICENCs Hans and Sybil, and they came up with the fact that personality can range along two different dimensions. They suggested that it ranged along stability, and it ranged along stability, or it ranged along introversion, extroversion, and that's sorry, my watch, an extroversion, and that most human personality can actually be captured by those two specific dimensions, and that's what they were referring to and what they found. Now, the other thing that oftentimes distinguishes folks is relative to what ANS, autonomic nervous system, reactivity. Jerome Kagan mentioned the fact that you can actually see people and their differences in reactivity by the level of arousal that exists even in their frontal cortex, for example. But basically what Kagan was suggesting was that based on reactivity, personality develops out of the interaction between heredity, what we're actually given, endowed with, and the environment and the interaction of those two. So where do ANS reactivity come from? Usually a lot of times it comes wired into us, and that's part of what defines personality from Kagan's point of view. Another perspective is in terms of introverts and extroverts, is like I mentioned a minute ago, was arousal level. And so essentially extroverts have a relatively low arousal level in their brain activity, and so therefore they interact with the world more actively to gain more arousal activity levels. And that's part of what defines extroverts from introverts. Introverts have a higher level of brain activity level, and so therefore they're not real anxious to interact with the world around them. The I-Syncs, getting back to this for just a second, is that this chart that you have in your book, this is the chart that they produced, and here's the introverted, extroverted, unstable, and stable, and how we can actually divide people up, if you want to do it that way, into that. Now, the other category, other way of discerning traits would be through a variety of testing devices, and one that you probably are fairly familiar with is the MBTI, or the Myers-Briggs type indicator. And what these guys did was they divided people up into personality types according to Jung's categories. And remember, we talked about Carl Jung in the last video when we were talking about Neo-Freudians. And basically, in this case, the Myers-Briggs type indicator is a good example of categorical approach to the traits of people. And that is key to understand, is that it is a categorical approach. And so the very nature of that tends to be such that that we only think in terms of the categories rather than in terms of the actual data of the person themselves.